Okay, and now we're going to talk about the actual components of these polygon objects that make them up. So I'm going to go ahead and select my torus and hit the F button, and that's going to focus my camera on this torus. It also changes the pivot point of the camera. So the pivot point of the camera that I'm looking through is now in the center of this torus, which means that when I rotate, I'm going to be rotating around this torus. So that's a very convenient thing about that hotkey. So again, that's the F button. Works with anything. It also works with a group of things. So if I select multiple things and hit that button, it's going to find the common pivot point among all of them. And it's also going to frame the camera so that I can see everything. But anyway, I'm going to look at this torus, and I'm going to just go ahead and hide everything else in this scene that I don't want to work with. And there's a hotkey for that. It's right up here, this little eyeball, hide unselected. And if you hit it again, it'll bring those objects back. So again, nothing's being deleted from the scene. You can see in our outliner here, we've got a list of different things. All these represent one of these objects in the scene. And if I hit the hide unselected button, they don't go away. They just turn invisible. And you can also see here that they become a little bit grayed out. So the only one that's not grayed out is our torus here. So anyway, just to make that clear. Now I've got that on a hotkey, and so you may see me toggle between this all the time. But just know that whenever I'm hiding everything else, and this little text appears up here, then I'm using this hotkey right here. And you're more than welcome, and in fact I encourage you to take the code from this shelf item and put it on a hotkey yourself, because I use it all the time when I'm working, and I'm sure you will too. Okay, so back to polygons. If you notice, well, of course you've noticed, we have edges going across this object, and that's basically everything that this thing is composed of. Edges, and they're connected by these little points right here. So if you right click on the polygon, it's going to bring up this little dialog box. You've got some options here: edges, object mode, UVs, multi, face, vertex face, and vertex, and we'll go through each of these. So to start out with, I'll go to vertex mode, and you may notice that what's happened is the object's edges have changed color, and these little purple dots have appeared at the intersections of all these edges, and those are vertices. So if I select one, I'm now selecting a component of this object, and I can translate it around just like I would a normal object in my scene. So I can scale it down or up. I could rotate it, but it doesn't make sense to rotate a point, because this point just represents a location. It's not actually a thing in and of itself, per se, not like an object is. So rotating a point doesn't make sense because it doesn't have any physical space. But if you were to select multiple points and rotate them, that does make sense, because now there's some relation to something else. So you can also scale them up and down. But again, you couldn't scale just one point, because that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so those are vertexes, or the plural of that is vertices. At least that's what I say. It's not in the dictionary though, so maybe it's just a word I made up, but I call them vertices instead of vertexes. Okay, so moving on to edges. So as you might have guessed, edges are these little guys right here. And you can control them in exactly the same way, except scaling does make sense. And rotating a single edge does make sense. And you can also translate them. Also, this marking menu that I bring up with the right mouse button is something that I'll be doing all the time, and I'll be doing it very quickly. It's just become second nature. It will for you too, it just takes some time. Okay, so object mode is the mode that you normally see objects in Maya displayed as. The object mode refers to the object itself, or the collection of all these components. So you go into component mode, and then you can go back out of component mode. And by the way, I also have hotkeys for these too, so you may see me switch from time to time. Okay, so UVs, not something we're going to be dealing with so much in this class, but I can roughly explain what they are. If we were to apply a texture to this object, we would use these to map out the texture space. So it basically is referred to, or it's referring to something that is outside of modeling, where you apply some kind of color or shading to this object. And you can't really manipulate these in 3D. They're limited to the 2D texture editor, which I can bring up to show you really quick. So this is the texture editor, and it's basically showing you like a pelted out version of this object. So just to show you what I'm talking about, this is not something you need to know how to do. But I can create a texture and map it onto that object. Okay. And now if I manipulate the UVs, which I can only manipulate in this editor, you'll see what I mean. So as I scale these down into a narrow band, the texture is adjusting accordingly. So this checker is, I'll turn this back on, is really what I'm manipulating here. So if I scale it down this way, it's going to change. And then I can also just move these around. Let's see. So you can see what's happening. So this is not something you have to worry about, but just so you know what UVs are. I'll close this down. This is called the Hypershade. Okay. So multi is this fancy thing that they came out with in Maya 2008, I think, where they basically have set it up so that whatever you select, whatever your mouse hovers over, will be the type of component that you select. So it's kind of handy. You can definitely work that way if you want to. I typically will not do this. It's just the way I work, but I'm sure other people do work that way. Okay, then we've got faces, which are these boundaries that are squared off by these edges and the vertices themselves. So again, same things applies. You can grab these and move them around or rotate them, what have you. Vertex Face, I've never really found a use for this. I think the reason it exists is so that you can see faces when they're really close-knit together. It might be slightly easier to see them this way, but you can't really do anything in this mode. So it's just sort of like a visual thing. Nevertheless, there it is. And I've accidentally gone into this mode probably 10,000 times over the last 9 years or so. Okay. And that brings us back to vertices. So there's also something we can do besides just rotating, translating, and scaling these components. If we want to, we can delete them altogether. So I'll do this with an edge first. Oh yeah, and you can also focus on components. So you can focus on anything, and again, that's with the F button. So I can now zoom into this specific selection of edges, which is really, really convenient. Also, if you can't find something in your scene, like maybe there's like 5,000 of these objects, and they're really small like this, and I just can't find where that is anymore. I can't even see it. If I know the name of it, I can find it in the outliner, and then hit F, and it'll go right to it. So that's also a nice trick. But I was just going to say that besides rotating and translating, etc., these different components, we can actually just get rid of them altogether. We can delete them. And that will fundamentally change the way this object looks. So let's say I get rid of this. I'm just going to use the delete key on my keyboard. And now you can see that those edges have gone away, and they're replaced with this face here. And so this face will have more than 4 edges, which is something that we're going to try and avoid doing as a general approach. We want to try and stay with a mesh that's all quad for reasons that will become more clear a little bit later. But anyway, you can do this, and if you want to, you can delete faces too. And this is interesting because now we're seeing inside of the object. You see that? I'll just turn this off. So you can actually create a hole right in your object if you want, which is kind of cool. So there's one other thing I'll tell you really quickly about Polygon objects like this, and that is that there's another component that's sort of hidden from view, and they're called normals. Let me turn off the grid really quick. Go to Show Grid. Okay, so if you go to the Lighting tab on your viewport and you uncheck two-sided lighting, you're going to see something interesting happening, and that is that the inside of this object turns black. And the reason is because by default Maya is instructed to light both sides of geometry, but it's sort of a trick because there's really only one side that's renderable, and that's the side that the normals are poking out of. And to show you what I mean, I'm just going to go to Display, Polygons, and Face Normals. And so what you're going to see here is that it sort of looks like a little cactus. Every single face on this mesh now has a line pointing off of it. And that's not something I can actually select. It's just a display for me. It's a convenience for me to see what direction the face normals are facing. And so in a production setting, if you're going to be rendering something or handing it off to somebody else in a studio, etc., you're always going to want to make sure that the normals are facing the right way. So if it's a closed three-dimensional object, the normals should always be facing outward, not inward, because the side that has the normal is the side that can actually receive some sort of light. And to turn this back off, we can just go to Polygons and turn face normals back off. So it's a toggle. So when I'm working, I almost always have this lighting setup turned on. So two-sided lighting will be off. And that way I know that when I'm modeling something, I'm modeling the right side of it. If this were reversed for some reason, I'll go to Normals and Reverse, and that will just give you the opposite. So what I've done essentially is just turn this whole object inside out, where the inside is receiving light and the outside is not receiving any light whatsoever. It's just getting this weird kind of dark appearance. Now you'll notice that even though the inside is enclosed for the most part, there's still light inside, and that's just because there's not exactly like a real life lighting simulation happening right now. So the light is just passing right through this geometry and hitting the surface that can accept it. And it's actually passing right through, so there's no shadow information happening here. All we have is shading, which is just the gradation of color, or I should say the gradation of value across the surface. There we go. So as you may have guessed, I've got a lot of hotkeys, and that's another one I have, is reverse face normal. I've also got a hotkey for turning on that lighting, on and off. But that's how you get to it. It's just through the Normals menu, Reverse. And that about summarizes polygons for right now. There's a lot more to it that we're going to get into, but these are the most basic and general parameters of these objects that you should be aware of.